This is a brief audio review of Chapter 2, Karl Marx, for Sociology 410. Okay, so the chapter starts with this kind of overview of Karl Marx's philosophy and a little bit of his biography so you have an idea of the context and who this dude was. So they start talking about the concerns and predictions of Marx, and we're going to get into this a little bit more in depth in a moment. So one of Marx's main concerns was that even though people do their jobs, they can be easily replaced by another worker, or through technology and automation, be replaced by a machine. And that kind of leaves people in an unstable place in society. Even if they work hard, even if they do what they're supposed to do, they can just be replaced. So part of his prediction was, that the problems that were inherent in capitalism could be alleviated by the creation of a communist society. So certain economic inequalities and social injustices are inherent to capitalism. And so that can lead to the breakdown of society and what he thought would create a communist society in the kind of wreckage of capitalism. So he assumed that when people are free from their exploitation, they can then reach their full potential. So he advocated for communism replacing capitalism as a system. Marx believed that private property should be abolished and the class system should be destroyed so that communism would replace capitalism. And this is where property is owned by the people, and the people work and are paid according to their abilities and their needs. So though Marx's predictions that capitalism would be replaced by communism has not come true, his critique of capitalism continues to be really important to sociologists and resonate with us in contemporary society. That's why we're still talking about this guy. Okay, so his backstory a little bit. He was born in 1818 in Germany. He grew up in kind of a middle-class comfort. He decided to study law like his dad, and he also earned a doctorate in philosophy. So once he hits the career and intellectual development time period, he became a journalist and accepted an offer to write for a liberal paper in, kind of looking at the issues of the day, and he was moved up to editor. While he was a journalist, he got to know some socialist writers and revolutionaries, and they were important on his intellectual development. So he also started reading, different philosophical ideas as well. And he also studied the works of seminal political economist Adam Smith. So Adam Smith's that guy who wrote Wealth of Nations and has these 3 laws of economics that a lot of people still learn today. So this might be what you heard in an econ class in high school. So he has these 3 rules of economics. The first is the law of self-interest, which says that people work for their own good. The second is the law of competition, which argues that competition forces people to make better products for a lower price. And the third is the law of supply and demand. Again, if you've learned anything from econ, that's the one you learned. Or that enough goods would be produced at the lowest price to meet a demand in a market economy. So Marx read, Adam Smith's work. He also read David Ricardo's work, who's this old dead dude, this other guy, who was arguing for free trade, what's now called in economics comparative advantage. So it's the main basis for most economics beliefs or economists' beliefs in free trade today. So this suggests that nations can gain an international trade advantage when the forces on producing goods that have the lowest opportunity cost are compared to then the opportunity costs in other countries. So a benign example would be, let's say you decide not to go see a movie with your friends so you can study for a test. You're going to get a better grade on the test, but the cost is not seeing the movie or enjoying it. So you don't need to know a ton about them to understand Marx. Really, I just kind of want to pepper in a little backstory there. It's just important to understand kind of what their general arguments were about the economy to understand the context of Marx's arguments, which was basically to the contrary, right? He criticized these writers, and this helped him develop his philosophy and economic theories. So later he goes into collaboration with Friedrich Engels. So, he meets him in Paris. They're both journalists. They're both committed to communism. And they both got kicked out of places for their ideas. So Engels was the one, though, who paid Marx's debts and made it possible for his work to be published. So it's kind of ironic. It took capitalism to bring us communism, as Engels' family was rich and he's the one who paid for it. So anyway, as far as political activism and his later life, So Marx eventually moved to London and started looking much more at economics. So he produced a bunch of the books that we're going to talk about, including Capital, that really kind of solidified his arguments to the point to where we still talk about them today. So he died in 1883, but the work that he produced during that time period of his life is still really integral to the understanding and critique of modern day capitalism, even though we'll talk a little bit about how obviously the kind of capitalism he was seeing in his lifetime was different than the kind that we have today in some important ways. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution. By the middle of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution that began in Britain 100 years earlier was spreading through the rest of Western Europe. And so the result was the birth of modern capitalism and the rise of middle-class owners of capital, or what we call the bourgeoisie, right? These people that own the means of production, and that helps them rise to economic and political power. So to the context of what Marx is looking at, he's seeing this explosion of industrial capitalism happen in his own lifetime, right? In a very quick time period, you see a lot of social change taking place. So for instance, in the chapter, they talk about how in the first half of the 19th century, Manchester's population exploded by 1,000% as it rapidly became a major industrial city. And the excessive rate of population growth meant that families had to live in makeshift housing, often without heat or electricity, and they lived in dismal sanitary conditions that ended up fueling the spread of diseases. So the factories that people worked in were often very dangerous. They were often poorly ventilated, even though they were working with dangerous chemicals. They weren't well lit. And factory owners would typically, discipline workers, in very awful ways. So the idea was it was more important to produce the goods than to give people working conditions that were safe and secure. So those appalling living standards and the kind of work accidents and industry problems that were going on at the time led Ingalls to describe Manchester as hell on earth. So it's interesting that we think about this in the past, but however, in the chapter they also talk about how in 2012, the New York Times brought attention to the working conditions that were happening in Chinese manufacturing plants that produce iPads and iPhones. So this included poor working conditions, also exposure to toxic chemicals, a lot of needless worker deaths as a result of safety issues, and even children working in some of these cases. But reports of people, there's also reports that people were standing for so many hours that their legs would swell to the point where they could hardly walk. And this is all to produce these goods that we kind of take for granted and use in our daily life. So I'm going to put in your additional resources a video I wanted to go over with this chapter, kind of discussing the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It's a famous historical event that happened in New York in the early, 20th century. And what's interesting about it is how it galvanized workers' rights and labor union rights within America. And so what happened was basically these workers were in this factory, the factory lit on fire, and because the owners had locked the stairwells to make sure that people couldn't union organize, make sure they couldn't steal the products, a lot of people burned alive. Some people decided to jump from the roof or from, high up on the building so that their families would have a body to bury. It's a very, very tragic incident. And the majority of the people who died in that fire were, poor immigrant women. So the reason I wanted to bring that up as well is to show you a video that happened almost 100 years later from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, but it happened in Bangladesh. And it's almost word for word the exact same situation, but the difference is how people responded, and really to kind of illustrate that as much as we've removed the sweatshops from America in a lot of ways, there are more industrial workers in the world today than ever before. And so all these products we have, all these goods we have, they come from somewhere, right? And often they come from very exploitive conditions, but they're happening in factories that have been offshored. So they're out of sight, out of mind. So please watch that in your additional resources. I'll pop that on Canvas for you. Just a quick video. And again, Warning on that one, though, there is graphic footage of people also jumping from that building so their families could have a body to bury. So again, just to kind of illustrate, what Marx was talking about way back in those days, there are very clear parallels to today. So Marx sees what's going on in the world, seeing the changes in the economy, and he kind of wants to create this theoretical model to change the world. And it was just in reaction to the dire conditions that people were living in. So he wanted to not just understand what was going on, but he wanted to change it. So by doing this, he centered his analysis on the forces and relations of production and the economic classes that they give rise to. So the forces of production are sometimes what we call the means of production, refers to the raw materials, technology, machines, factories, and land that are necessary to produce goods. And the relations of production refer to how individuals are related to each other. So in capitalism, individuals are related to each other as competitors. And the forces of production are, the owners basically have the forces of production, and it's their ability to make wage, or to basically make money off of wage laborers. And they're the ones who get to control labor power, how labor operates, the conditions of which, all of that stuff. So for Marx, social classes are groups of individuals who share common position relative to the forces of production. And each class is distinguished by what it owns with regards to the means of production. Private ownership of the means of production, in his view, leads to social class relations that are based on domination and exploitation. So one of the terms he comes up with to understand this is commodification. So laborers only have their ability to work in exchange for money that can then be used to purchase goods necessary for survival. So in this way, much like the goods they produce in factories, laborers themselves are a product to be bought and sold. For Marx, this class struggle is the catalyst for social change and the prime mover of history. Modern sociologists have taken the concepts of commodification to apply it to a lot of things that we experience in our modern society. For instance, the American healthcare system, which turns life-saving treatments into financial gains for lucrative corporations, often at the cost of actual life-saving patient care. So it comes down to this idea of, is healthcare a right, or is it only for those who can afford it? Because our healthcare is tied to our labor, many people have to stay at their jobs to continue to receive healthcare coverage. And fewer jobs offer these protections, which further complicates the issues of poor workers being able to afford healthcare. So commodification, all of us have had to experience how different that is in our society than pretty much every other society in the Western world that doesn't have a commodified or fully commodified healthcare system. They often have single-payer, universal, or otherwise healthcare coverage where individuals don't have to worry about going into bankruptcy because they got sick or they got in an accident of some kind. And as we know in America, even people who are wealthy or middle class can easily, be one bad illness away from total bankruptcy because of the commodification of healthcare in our system. All right, so that's one fuzzy example. Let's move on to how his theory was a reaction to this laissez-faire capitalism. So Marx developed his theory basically trying to counteract the thoughts of the time, like I was saying before, the kind of Adam Smith analysis. And the idea behind that form of capitalism that was being promoted is that any and all should be free to enter and compete in the marketplace of goods and services without any sort of regulations that artificially distort supply and demand and disturb the natural adjusting of prices. So the economy would be controlled by those in the best position to dictate its course and development, the consumers and the producers. Adam Smith, this term is often called like the invisible hand, right? As they call it. So according to Smith, a system of perfect liberty is created that generates greater wealth for all and promotes the general well-being for society. So what's interesting is the overlaps between Marx's and Smith's analysis. They're looking at the same thing, but they're looking at it very differently. So both Marx and Smith viewed history as unfolding through evolutionary stages in economic organization, and both understood the central role of government to protect the privilege of the wealthy through upholding the right to private property. But there was important differences in the two theories. Marx insisted that far from establishing a system of perfect liberty, as Adam Smith was saying, instead Marx says private ownership of the means of production leads to alienation of workers, which we'll talk about a bit in a moment. So although capitalism produces self-betterment for the owners, it necessarily prevents workers from realizing their essential human capacity to engage in creative labor. So Marx argues that when human actions are no different from those of a machine, the individual becomes dehumanized. Okay, so another core argument of Marx is that capitalism is inherently exploitive. So it's the labor power of workers that produces the products that are sold by the owners of those businesses. So workers mine the raw materials, they tend to the machines, and they assemble the products. And again, remember the context in which he was making these arguments. Today, we could kind of apply this also to a kind of post-industrial society like America, which we'll talk about later on. But anyway, we'll talk about some other theorists that build upon this later. So again, the workers mine the materials, they tend to the machines, they assemble the products, but the owner is the one who makes the profits that are generated by the sale of those goods. So business owners are always going to look at the profit. They're going to look at their bottom line, right? As far as what kind of choices they're going to make about the business in the future. And so one of the basic truths of capitalism is it takes money to make money. And the more money a business owner has, the more ability they have to generate profit-making schemes. So capitalists can pay as little as they want to pay as little as they can, so they can skim off that difference. So Marx sees profit as theft. And what you're stealing is the talent and hard work of your workforce. Marx says that capitalism is paying a worker one price for doing something and selling it to another for a higher price. So profit becomes the fancy term for exploitation. Also under capitalism, concentration of wealth happens into fewer hands. Though competition between capitalists can lead to greater levels of productivity, it also results in this concentration of wealth. And, we're seeing this obviously in America, right? You have a couple people, just a handful of people that have more money than entire governments, than anyone else in the entire world. The combined wealth of America's richest 400 individuals is now more than the combined wealth of the poorest 150 million adults. So we're seeing a pretty extreme version of this even to this day. Hence why I think Karl Marx is still something that's so controversial. If you hear anything about Marx without reading him directly, you just hear bad things or Marxism, and it's like kind of woo, scary. But I think what it really is that it's challenging the system that makes people in power powerful, and that's going to make them uncomfortable. So the proletariat, just definitionally, we talked about the bourgeoisie are the people who own. The proletariat are the ones who are the wage earners. And so Marx says that first, the proletariat is transformed into an overwhelming majority of the population, making its class interests an irresistible force for change. So he argues that there's a potential in the working class to overthrow this kind of exploitive system. So the former capitalists also bring with them a level of education and understanding that isn't possessed by the typical wage laborer. They don't have that privilege, right? So Marx basically is saying that he thinks that the workers need to generate what's called class consciousness, an awareness on the part of the working class of its common relationship to the means of production and common source of workers' oppressive conditions. Meaning, people need to understand how they're being exploited. So Marx believed that this awareness was a vital key for sparking a revolution that would create what he called a dictatorship of the proletariat. So transforming it from a wage-earning, propertyless mass into themselves being the ruling class. So you can see why rich people wouldn't really like that idea going around society. So, the idea was that capitalism was just another stage in this historical economic evolution, what he considered the last period that would be rooted in competitive class conflict. Because just a fun fact about Marx, he liked to look at historical analyses over time, and he paralleled what happened during the time periods of, the royals, where you had the gentry, right, the lords and the ladies and the kings and the queens and all those folks, the dukes and the duchesses. And then you had the serfs, all the people who worked for them. And basically found a pretty strong parallel between the labor conditions, the concentration of wealth, the way in which political power and economic power was wielded during the time of royalty as it was to the time of the advent of industrialized capitalism. So basically, he was hoping that, workers would throw off their chains. They have nothing to lose but their chains, basically, is what he said. And that they would realize, hey, we're being screwed. Let's change this to, something more equitable. And he thought, after that, we're just going to be in a utopia. So he wanted folks to create a centralized socialist economy, using the power of the state to abolish private ownership of the means of production. So the proletariat would gain control of those productive forces from the hands of the bourgeoisie and create a centralized socialist economy. Without private ownership of the means of production, society would no longer be divided along class lines. And without antagonistic class interests, the struggle over resources and those social conditions that are causing all the conflict and the alienation, those things would then go away. So without conflict that fuels social change, the dialectical progression of human history comes to a utopian end, right? So basically, if you got machines working instead of people, if you have so much productivity in the economy, then instead of having workers constantly working more and more jobs, if anything, than in the past, the idea is you free people up with their time and their interests to be more varied human people, to cultivate their natural talents and find their full potential. So it's not about not working. It's more about working in a way where your hidden talents or your specialities, the things that make you you, that are powerful and can help the world, can come out of you instead of you just clocking in and working as a cog in a machine in a factory every day. So Marx's vision was this ending of prehistory, as he calls it. So basically getting ourselves to that communist utopia and ending those contradictions of capitalism. Okay, so moving on to some of his theoretical orientation. So looking at the question of order in class conflict, Marx saw human society as evolving towards an ultimate utopian end. But you get there from having class conflict, right? Because those who have, those who don't, they struggle. The idea is the poor realize, hey, this isn't fair. I think a really great modern example of that is what came out of the Occupy movement, this idea of the 99% and the 1%. When in fact, too, especially the people who really control our economy are almost like the 0.001%, right? But still, this notion that 99% of the people have an incredibly different experience than this 1%, right? So it's this struggle to control the forces of production and the distribution of resources and profits that leads classes and to basically be the primary movers of history instead of individuals to be the movers of history. So each historical stage implodes upon itself in a revolution that casts aside one ruling class for another. So again, they cut off all the heads of the kings and the queens and the gentry, but then industrialized capitalism takes over and it creates a very similar ruling class problem. So parameters that shape individual actions are also something he looked at. So, individuals don't really chart their paths in the way that they could if they were given their full human potential. We think and we act within the limits of what's established for us in the context of how we live. And especially this is true when it comes to who gets to determine what is right and wrong and what are the social values in society. These are often the people with more power. So individuals are born into society where the forces and relations of production, so meaning the available technology and the ability to make stuff and the property relations, are already there, right? You just are born into it. So we often just kind of conform our lived experiences to that, what exists. And so Marx was basically saying that we can change these things, especially the more that we understand them. So from the existing economic, or what he calls, the material base, is born a superstructure, or the social, political, and intellectual life processes in general. The superstructure consists of everything non-economic in nature, such as your legal, political, and educational systems, and just common sense knowledge. So as a result, an individual's consciousness is not determined by their own subjectivity, but largely by, again, the context in which they're living and the ways in which the powerful kind of get to dictate what reality is. So when it comes to this rationalist motivation for action, Marx's work is primarily rationalist. So basically, he's looking at class-based interest. And he's saying that what makes humans distinct from other animals is our ability to consciously intervene in the world, to mold it to our own goals and needs. And so when we have freely developed people that are able to just, be conscious and live their lives, they can then achieve their full human potential, or what he calls the species being, to forge meaningful relationships with other people. That you produce things because you have a passion for them, because it means something to you, because you have a particular skill that you share with the world. More so than, you work 16 hours a week, 16 hours a day, standing on your feet in a factory making iPhones, right? So it's the individual's interest to control their labor and the production process that creates this potential, like this full potential for humans. So meaning, in most situations when people, especially in the industrialized capitalism he's talking about, or people working on a factory line, it's not like you make the first Model T and you get to keep it, or it's not like you get to kind of control the way you do these things. Or in a modern example, we'll talk more about Ritzer and McDonaldization later, but this idea that if you're working like fast food or something like McDonald's, everything is so routinized for you of how you do these things, right? Each task is almost like broken down like an assembly line kind of situation. It's not like you're a short order cook and you get to cook the things like you like to cook them and you have your own spin on it and your own influence. Everything is done exactly in a routinized way. So it takes you and your humanity out of the picture. You become a machine, basically. So Marx here is basically saying that, our actions are driven by our attempts to maximize our own interests. And, we're motivated by this want to, promote our own class interests. And that, again, if people are given an opportunity to, have full human potential, the species being, then that's going to create this much more utopian society where people feel valued, they don't have that alienation, they're not facing exploitation where their hours and hours of work are being given to someone else's profit, and that's going to create a much more utopian society. So in the book, The German Ideology, Marx wanted to reformulate the work of Hegel, who said that change was driven by a dialectical process in which a given idea, or a thesis, contains within it the seeds of an opposing idea, its antithesis. So the resolution of this inescapable opposition between thesis and antithesis will produce a new idea, a synthesis, that grows out of the two opposing ideas. So the synthesis then forms the basis of a new thesis and a related antithesis. So the idea of this kind of dialectics in society that change kind of creates in a cyclical way. So, looking at Hegel's dialectics and reality is a production of our conceptual categories that make up our consciousness and thus has no existence independent of our own construction of it. As our ideas or knowledge changes, so does reality. The stages of history or reality are then marked by progressive changes in conceptual categories that order our experiences. So in the German ideology, Marx, does use or build upon some of Hegel's philosophy, but he also changes a bit of it, right? So, he does think that there's a progressive dialectical process going on, but he thinks that it's a material existence, not consciousness, that fuels historical change and the inevitable march towards freedom. So in contrast to Hegel's idealism, which Hegel says descends from heaven to earth, Marx's materialism is trying to ascend from earth to heaven, meaning to try to make heaven on earth, right? So this inversion reflects a shift from a non-rationalist theoretical orientation of Hegel that emphasizes the roles of ideas in shaping social life to a rationalist orientation that emphasizes the strategic pursuit of interests. So the German ideology is pivotal writing because it offers the fullest treatments of Marx's materialist conception of history. In it, Marx argues that our ideas and interests have no existence independent of the conditions in which we live and work. Marx is arguing that the essence of individuals, what they truly are, or how they see the world, is determined by their material economic conditions. So then looking at, the ruling class and their ideas, Marx maintains that the dominant economic class controls not only society's means of material production, but the production of ideas as well. For instance, how do we view people who are unemployed? Do we see them as lazy, as bad? Or do we see them as free from the exploitation that is wage labor? So why is it that we see them as bad? Right? What's the point of having technology in our workforce if not to free us up from labor so we can spend more time enjoying and living our lives? So why then is our productivity so high? Like in this country, for example, while our wages have remained stagnant for about 50 years. So the capitalist ideas teach all of us to be anxious, competitive, conformist, and politically complacent. And the principle of individual freedom, is something that is not universal or promoted through capitalism. So the development of capitalism as an economic system is based on the notion of freedom of workers, right? That they're free to find work or to quit their jobs. And entrepreneurs are free to open a business or close a business or hire a person or fire a person. In order for competitive capitalism to develop to its fullest potential, individuals must be able to move, work, learn new skills, and invest their capital freely. So the concept of freedom in this capitalist notion is born out of the capitalist mode of production and the nature of the social relationships that it demands. But we understand that it really serves the economic and political interests of the ruling class. When your choices, your freedom as a worker is to work multiple jobs and then pick up extra gig jobs after, it's not freedom in the same sense as we understand it in other contexts. All right, moving from that to the economics and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, he speaks in this book about the conditions of alienation, that work can be a source of meaning or happiness in someone's life, but the type of working conditions that are often seen under capitalism can instead lead to an experience of alienation. Marx said that workers need to see themselves in the items they create. And with capitalism, jobs became much more specified, which is what makes the economy highly efficient, but can also lead to alienation, which is the dehumanizing separation of workers from the means of the production, the product of their labor, their own species being, and humanity as a whole under capitalism. So in the essay Alienated Labor, he examines the conditions of alienation or estrangement and says it's an inherent feature of capitalism. So workers are alienated in multiple ways. They're alienated from themselves because they become an object that performs a routinized task. They're alienated from their own production, from themselves. A wage earner spends 2/3 of their waking hours engaged in meaningless activity, right? Basically, you have to work to survive, but the kind of work you're doing is often, again, all the money is going to someone else and you have no control over the labor itself. So torn away from the object of labor, humans are then not able to realize the essence of their creative nature or their species being through their work. So workers become alienated from the work itself, from themselves, and from the rest of humanity, because they just become another commodity to be bought and sold. And think of it this way too, under capitalism, it pits workers against each other. Like I'm sure you've seen this whenever you've seen, unionized strikes. What happens? You often have scab labor, people that will come in. It's kind of ironic, right? Because it'll be a situation where a capitalist employer will say, we can't give these people a raise. And so they go on strike, and then they'll hire people in to work, for those striking workers at a much higher rate of pay that they wouldn't promise to their normal workforce. It's just kind of ironic. So anyway, basically it makes us competitors. It makes us, enemies of each other, instead of that kind of class consciousness that makes people realize that we're all being exploited through this kind of system together. So also in The Power of Money in Bourgeoisie Society, Marx extends his critique of capitalist production to money itself and says money is a medium capable of being exchanged not only for specific goods or services, but also for traits like beauty, intelligence, talent, or honesty. And so money is the alienating ability of mankind that binds us to life itself and our relationships with others. So he contrasts the non-rationalist dimensions like, we briefly talked about with Hegel. And part of this is the concern of the subjective consequences of the capitalist system, which reflects a non-rationalist dimension to his argument that contrasts with his overall rationalist orientation. So Marx is basically saying that, not just focusing on the nature of class interests and the struggle to realize them, but also, again, the more moral critique that, yes, there is we can look at facts and figures and see the ways in which, conditions are unequal or lead to alienation. But also, what about the kind of social and moral degradation that happens because of a system in which people are degraded or oppressed, or, that capitalism is bringing to society. So it's kind of interesting. He's sprinkling in a little bit of that in there as well. Okay, moving on to probably the most famous work, Communist Manifesto, also with Engels in the mix there. What's interesting about the Communist Manifesto is it's deliberately adversarial. Again, this is why it's so controversial to this day. It's intended to aspire allegiance in the movement's cause, and the movement there is producing communism. Now, why is that so controversial? I think part of it is because a lot of the societies that have quote unquote taken up this mantle have actually been authoritarian societies, have actually been dictatorships under the guise of communism or socialism. So the true communist ideal or utopia that Marx set out to produce has not actually shown itself on this earth yet. So anyway, the Communist Manifesto is still very important to kind of understanding today. And it describes economic processes that lead to, the rich people ascending into higher social classes, while basically the consequence is the wealthier they get, the more obvious this inequality becomes, which hint is happening kind of like right now, that this produces its own gravediggers, as he calls it. So basically, you create a class-conscious proletariat. And once the proletariat understands, hey, this isn't fair, right? These conditions are awful, these working conditions are bad, then they can basically cause the downfall of, capitalism and the rise of the proletariat as a powerful class. So, really Communist Manifesto is looking as a, theory of social change to try to understand the dynamics of capitalism and, basically say to find a way to create what he considered a much more just system, right? So given the dynamics of capitalism, capitalists must forever seek to eliminate their competitors or cut back on their productive capability to minimize oversupply of goods. So it's funny, it's like the problem under capitalism isn't scarcity. It's too many things. We can produce too many things too quickly that can saturate a market. So capitalism itself is just marked by a series of crises. And that's something he wanted to kind of counteract, right? So, for instance, if production is reduced, capitalists have to then reduce the workforce, and with it the source of their profit, as well as the size of the market able to purchase their goods. Meanwhile, the factory conditions themselves facilitate the development of a revolutionary class consciousness, meaning when everyone's stuck in the factory, working in horrible conditions, this kind of gives an opportunity for people to realize, hey, they're not the only ones struggling, other people are too. So through this, workers come to realize the true source of their alienation and the possibility of breaking free from the chains of their enslavement. So the communist utopia hinges on the abolition of private property. And so the means of production become collectively owned, and the exploitations of workers is then no longer possible. So alienation is also ended because the worker is now part owner of the enterprise. So they're able to have control over how things are produced, of how, the products are made, of the conditions of which work happens. So worker is no longer estranged from themselves or their species being. So the competition for profit that characterizes bourgeoisie capitalism is also brought to a close with communism and those recurring economic crises, right? These cycles of boom and bust the large recessions that plague capitalism, right? Again, because under capitalism, and especially the way in which we can produce so many goods, it's really, again, a recurring economic crisis of too much stuff. So the utopia then is a world without private wealth, but with what he considered a graduated income tax and centralized control of banking, communication, and transport industries, as well as free public education. So it's interesting kind of using these analyses that he talks about here to look back at the Great Recession of 2007 through 2009, which was the US's worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And it's kind of an interesting way to apply Marx's ideas. So just as Marx predicted, the United States was by no means alone in experiencing economic dramatic downturns as the spread of capitalism took hold. And so this has ensured that economic crises are not confined to one country's border, but now they reach the entire globe. So to compensate for the loss of revenue, what did the capitalists do? They fired workers. They scaled back production. They slashed prices so they could sell their products. And so this meant, many people became unemployed. Many people ended up homeless and had all sorts of, life consequences as a result. And again, this production itself was stopped by capitalists so that they could, basically for their bottom line. Remember, especially if you're a publicly traded company, under capitalism, you need to make more money than last quarter, every quarter, every quarter, every quarter. But as we know, even from the kind of basic supply and demand arguments of the economic theorists that that he's grappling with, at some point you tap out on how many people you can sell stuff to. So oftentimes then you cut corners by then paying your workers less and less, or moving your industries offshore or outsourcing them to find labor that's cheaper so that you can still have that surplus value on their labor. So anyway, basically, what's interesting about that time period too, especially for applying Marx's analysis, is where's the invisible hand on that, right? If all these banks basically sold all these very predatory loans to people for their homes, and then basically what they did came back to roost, they didn't let the banks fail though, right? That would have been true capitalism. It's just, hey, you were on the free market, you failed, the end, right? But to stem the tide of that fallout, because they didn't want an even more severe depression to take hold, and they didn't want, a huge global economic meltdown, governments intensified their interventions in those economies. And how did they do that? They did it by basically taking the kind of tax wealth of the many and using it to bail out these large industries that were, engaging in these horrible processes that led to these issues. So they rescued the rich people while letting drown the millions of struggling homeowners, or what they called during the kind of Occupy time period, bailing out Wall Street, but not bailing out Main Street. And so this was Marx would have been like, yep, of course they did, right? And the fact that so many of these banksters even ended up getting golden parachutes. Oh, that whole thing is so amazing. Golden parachutes are basically you did a job so badly, you destroyed this entire bank or this, whatever it is, company. But they're like, okay, we'll give you a couple $1 million out the door because we don't want you to land too hard, right? Hence the golden parachute. I've never been fired from a job, but I can't imagine being fired from a job because I was so incredibly incompetent. And then they're like, well, here's a couple $1 million on your way out of taxpayer money. Anyway, don't get me started on the recession. Okay, so in Capital, he looks more at use value and exchange value and some of these other kind of theories that he's coming up with, like surplus value. So we're going to go through all this terminology real quickly here. So basically, Marx is exploring the source of value by asking what determines worth or price of goods that are bought and sold on the market. A commodity, so let's use the example of a bike, right? Like a bicycle. So a bike has both a use value and an exchange value. So you can use the bike by riding it as a bike or as transportation or recreation, or you can exchange that bike for another commodity. So use value just means the utility of a commodity, how useful it is to a person. And so use value refers to the qualities of commodities. It can't be established a quantifiable standard for measuring the price of goods. As a measure of quantity, however, exchange value, on the other hand, does express equivalencies. So how much a given commodity it takes to equal the value of another commodity. So because exchange value is derived from the trade of commodities, it can't be a property inherent in the commodity itself. So that just means the exchange does not take into account the specific qualities of the bike or the quality of labor conditions that made that bicycle. Instead, it's dependent on what goods are being exchanged. So this leads to what he calls commodity fetishism, which we'll cover in a moment. So the labor theory of value is also important to understand as well. So the value of an object is determined ultimately by the amount of labor time it takes. So the hours, the weeks, the months that it took to produce it. In a capitalist economy, those who do not own the means of production have no choice but to sell their labor power in order to survive. So the value of labor power is equivalent to the costs incurred by the worker for food, clothing, shelter, training, other goods necessary to live in society, to be able to support themselves and their family and be able to go to work the next day. So this is kind of where it leads to surplus value. Surplus value is the difference between what workers earn for their labor and the value of the goods that they produce that capitalists then sell for a higher price. So it's the source of capitalist exploitation of the worker because the worker gives more than is given in return without having any voice in the relationship of that exchange. So the capitalist can increase his absolute surplus value by extending the hours of a working day, right? Or he can increase their relative surplus value by increasing the productivity of labor by instituting time-saving procedures. So again, every time I think about that argument, I think about Amazon warehouses, the idea that people were peeing into bottles because they weren't allowed to go to the bathroom. I mean, technically they're allowed to go to the bathroom, but the idea is that relative surplus value, the productivity of labor, the fact that they have to, if you're working in the factory, you have to get X amount of boxes and X amount of trucks in a certain time period, or you're not going to get a raise, or you might even face consequences at work. Means that people were just peeing into bottles, right? So again, there's many ways to apply these theories to the modern world. So to the extent that mechanized production decreases necessary labor time, because now you have machines that can make stuff and now labor time can go down, surplus value is increased along with the level of worker alienation and exploitation. The idea is the machines were supposed to help us create more leisure time. But that's not actually what's been happening, right? It's just been producing more wealth for the capitalist class. So when looking at long-run costs of competition for markets, specialization and mechanization force more workers into unstable employment and marginal existence. So if you're needed to perform only the most monotonous of unskilled tasks, it means you're easily replaceable and expendable. And this also connects back to the Industrial Reserve Army. This idea that there's these people who are underemployed or unemployed. And it's a big population of the proletariat, that they're just overworked. And there's basically plenty of people to replace you to pull from, right? So the idea there too is that, because of the way in which work has been, very specialized, you only need to know a specific skill to do it. Again, it just makes it easier to, someone wants to get a raise, you're like, no, that's fine. We'll just fire you and bring someone in at a lower rate, right? Because there's so many people to pull from in that kind of system. So recurring crises of overproduction and boom or bust are endemic to capitalism, while the economic recessions and depression wages become more severe. So commodity fetishism is just this distorted relationship that exists between individuals and the production and consumption of goods. So Marx was trying to explain how labor that's exchanged for a wage creates a product, right? That bike, right? So labor is exchanged for wage, creates a bike, but it's treated as though it was an abstract thing that's equivalent to others. And this is where it gets a little complicated. He says commodity fetishism implies that we perceive the relationships between and among things instead of between and among people, and the people involved in the relationship are then treated like things. So we tend to assume They are just things like all the stuff that we have, our computers, our technology, our clothes, everything, that it just appears out of thin air. But instead of appearing out of thin air, they're really products of the labor of a bunch of proletariat folks. And that meaning is stripped away from the product itself. So this is very true in our modern so-called post-industrial society, right? Because now that we don't work in factories that much, we kind of assume, well, that's the past. And the reality is there's more industrial workers in the world today than ever before. They're just happening offshore or, out of sight, out of mind. So Marx argues that we treat the goods we buy as if they have magical powers. He uses the term fetish, as it was used in the colonial sense, to mean an object invested with supernatural powers by those who worship it. So this could be a religious idol, or in our modern context, I suppose it could be a Tesla for some folks, right? So we lose sight of the fact that we create the commodities. In doing so, we allow them to master us by granting them a power that in reality these goods do not hold. Not only are commodities fetishized, but so too is the process of commodity production. When we blame machines for replacing our jobs or for our feelings of alienation, we endow them with human qualities of consciousness or intent or will that they don't have. So it's interesting when you really reflect on that. What kind of products does your generation fetishize? Right? I'm an elder millennial. And so for me, when I think about it, I think about Disney adults, right? No hating on that. I know and love a lot of Disney adults, but I'm not one of them because I'm not rich. And, this kind of fetishizing of all the stuff and the things and the emotion it brings you, right? These marketers really knew what they were doing with my generation when it came to some of this stuff of, trying to get us to go back to the comfort of childhood. Or another example of a product that my generation fetishizes would be like Airbnbs. We can't afford real homes, so we'll go stay in like a fancy vacation rental, right? So think about that. What kind of products does your generation fetishize? All right, let's move on to the circulation of commodities. So Marx describes the cycle or circulation of commodities as peculiar to capitalism. Unlike other economic arrangements, production under capitalism is driven by the quest for increasing profits and capital for reinvestment. So the cycle of exchange, by definition, capitalists enter into the economic exchange already possessing capital, right? This is the key, right? This is one of those things, it kills me all the time. Again, here's my elder millennial showing. There's a malignment of my entire generation, like we just don't care or whatever it is. And it cracks me up. Like they'll say, oh, just stop having your avocado toast, stop going to Starbucks so much, and you'll be able to be a millionaire or something. And I'm like, no, I crunched the numbers. I'd have like $100 more, but I wouldn't be a millionaire, right? So what's interesting is to become a capitalist, to be, successful in that realm, you need to already have money or raw materials or machinery for production, but in the current context, money to start a business, right? So you need capital. Like it takes money to make money is what they say, right? So if you want to expand your business and profits, a capitalist has to convert their money into a commodity by purchasing additional materials or machinery or labor. And then a capitalist then uses these commodities to produce other commodities that are sold for money. So again, it takes money to make money. For the proletariat, the cycle of exchange is very different. The worker enters into the labor market having only their labor power to sell as a commodity. So basically the worker becomes a product for the capitalist. His commodity labor is then exchanged for money or a wage. And then the worker takes that money and spends it on commodities that are necessary to their survival, then spurning on the capitalist class and supporting that kind of wage labor market. And the circulation of commodities then follows that pattern, right? Of commodity, money, commodity. So we'll talk later about theorists who expanded on Marx's work and how Marx was integral to conflict theory as a paradigm in sociology.